Hi, everybody. I'd like to start by extending a very warm welcome to everybody for today's Publics. Today's Publics is titled Sanitation for All, Cities and the Right to City Life. We're really delighted to have Colin here with us today for this talk. I know Colin needs very little introduction for this audience, but I'll just go ahead and do a little bit of a formal introduction. Colin McFarlane is a professor of urban geography at Durham University. His work is focused on the experience and politics of urban life. He's worked, of course, extensively, as we all know, on questions of infrastructure, service provision, politics, planning, and density as well. Today's talk is largely based on his recent book, Waste and the City, The Crisis of Sanitation and the Right to City Life. In today's talk and in the book, Colin argues that sanitation is one of modern urban life's most neglected issues. And here he will argue for a renewed equitable investment in sanitation as a foundation of urban social life. Adopting Lefebvre's concept of the right to the city, he uses the notion of city life to reframe the discourse on sanitation from a narrowly defined policy discussion to a question of the democratic right to public life. So we're really delighted to have you here with us, Colin. With that, I'll hand over to you. Just on logistics, the talk is around 1 hour long. Colin will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and we'll have around 20 minutes at the end for question and answers. So if anyone has a question, feel free to pop it into the Q&A box, and we'll be taking questions at the end with Colin. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks, Colin. Over to you.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Shreya, and thank you, Tanvi, for organizing. So I'm just going to try and screen share. Let's see if this works. So hopefully you can see that. Yep. Can you guys see that?
Yes, it works, Colin.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about this question of sanitation for all and the notion of city life and the right to city life through this idea of sanitation. And I want to begin, I suppose, by something which making a fairly uncontroversial, I think, sort of accepted point, which is that we are in a global sanitation crisis in cities, and it's one that is growing and deepening and worsening, particularly in its connections to climate change and inequality, but also to the way in which urbanization is proceeding across the world. And the book that Shreya kindly mentioned, which I'll come to at some point during the presentation, is really an effort to try to understand what the urban sanitation crisis is and what kinds of responses might be put forward in relationship to it, drawing on the work of many people, including people there, but also across the world. So I want to argue then for this idea of the right to city life as one hopefully useful way of thinking about sanitation, but also perhaps also thinking about other aspects of urban life and urban change, right? So I want to begin with 4 snapshots of the global urban sanitation crisis, right? So I'm going to read this just to give you a sense of the kinds of issues that I'm interested in here. So this is a quote. "I was submerged up to my shoulders in slush. I could feel it pulling me down, but somehow I held on to the slab. Then some people pulled me up and I passed out." So this is Sirajudin Turat's description of falling through a floor in a northeast Mumbai toilet block while waiting in a queue for the toilet block. It's not an isolated case, as we know. In a 3-month period of 2016 alone, for example, there were 7 deaths in Mumbai from similar incidents, people falling through the floors of toilet blocks into septic tanks below. In 2018, a 40-year-old municipal toilet block entirely collapsed, killing 1 person in Mumbai, and residents at the time said that they had told the municipality that it hadn't been maintained for years, and that it was vulnerable to collapse. In 2020, the side of a toilet block collapsed and killed a woman waiting in a queue. So these kinds of stories of substandard, inadequate, failing infrastructures are not unfamiliar. Of course, not just in India, but across many parts of the urban world. For example, in Kenya in 2019, a young girl dies when the school latrine that she was using collapses in on her when she's in the toilet. In the same year, in Limpopo province in South Africa, a 3-year-old boy dies while visiting his auntie when he falls into the pit toilet near the house and drowns. Horrific stories. So in addition to these shocking cases, there are thousands of sort of everyday struggles with inadequate toilets, as we know. So local community toilet blocks, such as these, for instance, that are vulnerable to collapse, as I was saying, but also which often lack basic infrastructure provision, right? That lack water, electricity, in many cases, things like functional doors, drains, pipes, water, and so on, and so forth, right? The material conditions which shape social worlds and sometimes end social worlds. And residents are often forced, of course, to do the dangerous work of maintaining these toilets, these drains, these pipes, the water, gathering the water, and repairing and paying for the often engendered ways, as we know, over and over again. Maintaining toilets, drains, and pipes which shape contaminated infrastructural worlds, to use Christina Schwenkel's phrase. At these toilets, privacy and safety can become compromised. The kinds of people who feel comfortable using them reduces and narrows. Quite often, for example, they become disproportionately infrastructures for men rather than women. And to add to that, the sheer pressure of the numbers of people using these inadequate, failing infrastructures, and the impacts on daily living that it has become profound. Sometimes in ways which are spectacular, like the collapse of a toilet block, but more often in everyday, subtle, small ways which leave a mark on the body, on people's ability to live and thrive in the city. In some parts of urban India, as we know, the numbers of people to a single toilet seat are over 1 in every 200 people, which is a tortuous equation of density and provisioning. So urban sanitation infrastructure then is not only woeful, people are dying trying to fix it. So one example, of course, as everyone in this audience would know, is this sort of ongoing scandal of manual scavenging in India. So, for example, in Hyderabad, we might think about how manual scavengers emerged from blocked drains, squeezed into narrow pipes, surrounded by raw sewage. There are stories recently, for example, in Delhi of 3 men killed trying to unblock a drain underneath the Indira Gandhi National Park, a National Centre for Arts. In Chennai, 2 men reported dying, suffocating, trying to unblock a 40-foot deep septic tank underneath a hotel in a wealthy part of the city. So these are men who are working without, not always men, of course, often women as well, working without safety gear, killed by asphyxiation from toxic gases, right? And these kind of stories are not unusual. This is from 2018. Mohan from Delhi tells the Indian Express, I've seen both my friends Deepak and Balwinder die in front of my own eyes. We told the contractors that the fire from the matchstick is not sustaining in the sewer, which is how they test about air quality. But he ignored us. My friends were asphyxiated. They just needed some money to eat that day, right? So you have these kind of deep, profound bodily vulnerabilities and damage done in relation to poverty and sanitation. Okay. So these stories of death from cleaning drains and sewers multiply in cities across not just India, but beyond India. As we know from India, manual scavenging, the practice of unblocking and cleaning toilets and drains, often conducted by sort of low-caste Dalits, affects something like 1.3 million people in India every day, working in cities, making a living through manual scavenging, many of them women, many paid less, of course, as we know, than the minimum wage, using boards, buckets, baskets carried on the head, exposing themselves to gases and wastes on a daily basis. And there are social movements, as we know, the Safai Karmachari Andolan, for example, SKA, that advocates for the rights of manual scavengers and campaigns across India, and who've made the point that, of course, if other castes had been involved, the solution would probably have been found long ago. So these are issues not just of poverty, not just of urbanism, but of caste, prejudice, discrimination, and so on. Which takes me to the second snapshot of the global urban sanitation crisis, which I've been exploring, and that's in relation to race, poverty, and sanitation. So let's move then from India to Centerville, a small town, one of the poorest towns in the United States. And here, residents are living with raw sewage that's been spilling out from poorly maintained sewers for decades, and they become accustomed to the thick stench in the air. When it rains, the sewage spills out of the network and across the city into homes, gardens, play areas, and open spaces. The pipes, pumps, and drainage are old and damaged. The manhole covers spout like water geysers into the street when the water is under pressure or when the rainfall is high. The water itself, the drinking water, has become contaminated and doesn't taste right. Illinois American Water, which is the utility which supplies most of the town's water, insists that the drinking water is safe, but people often buy bottled water instead. The smell means that it's sometimes difficult to sit outside. Some worry about the effect of the air on their lungs. There are stories of children becoming frightened of the rain. Homes have lost their value. Land is subsiding in several places. One resident says, "Can you imagine bringing your family up in waste, working all your life, and you've got to live in it and retire in it?" So Centerville is a town of around 5,000 predominantly Black residents, and it's long been neglected by state authorities. The utility activists' claim has ignored the residents. In the summer of 2021, for example, the activists filed a lawsuit against the sewer authority and the local state, demanding repairs and investment in the system. One prominent activist who's campaigned on sewage and poverty and race across America, Catherine Flowers, described the town's sanitation conditions as the worst, one of the worst she'd ever seen. The city's mayor claimed that the task was beyond the scope of the city's small budget and would require federal national spending and investment. Yet the plan that was put forward to the federal government involved no consultation with residents or groups who were affected and did not go anywhere near far enough as a plan. As elsewhere in America and beyond, residents have often been left cleaning up the mess themselves, maintaining the systems on their own. Catherine Flowers, has documented cases of open sewage across urban and rural America and sees the problem as one of race and class. This, she says, is a final monument to the Confederacy. So that's my second snapshot of the global urban sanitation crisis. I want to now move context again and come a little bit closer to home, for me at least, to the UK and the decline in public toilet provision. So if you walk along the River Thames in central London, a short walk from the Parliament, you'll see a small and discreet statue memorialising one of Britain's most important sanitation engineers. And it's easy to walk past it. It's a small bust of a very serious-looking Victorian man, embossed with the writing, "Sir Joseph Bazalgette, CB, engineer of the London main drainage system and of this embankment." Then a few meters below this memorial lies part of the sewer system that his name will be forever linked with, Bazalgette's sewer system. Built in the mid-19th century, the system of sewers remains among the most remarkable feats of engineering in London's history. The Metropolitan Board of Works, of which Bazalgette was chief engineer, constructed 5 sewers 36 feet beneath the surface, running parallel to the River Thames, and consisting of 82 miles of main lines, 1,000 miles of smaller lines, 318 million bricks, and 880,000 cubic yards of concrete. So accounts at the time compared the construction of the sewers to the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So sanitation provision in British cities has always had its limitations and exclusions, and I don't want to romanticize, the kind of idea of the heroic white Victorian man. We all know the violence that was done in the name of these kind of infrastructures, both in places like Britain, but also in places like India. But we have come a long way since these days of investing huge amounts of state money in large infrastructure spending for sanitation. In many ways, these days are entirely gone, or almost entirely gone. Today, for example, in British cities, there is no legal requirement for state provision of public toilets. Local authority spending on public toilets in British cities has severely declined in recent decades. Some regions have almost entirely stopped maintaining toilet blocks. And in the face of state cuts, government cuts in the name of austerity from central governments to local cities, public toilets were among the first provisions to be withdrawn from the state budgets. In London, more than half of all public toilets were closed after 1995. The central borough of Tower Hamlets, which is the densest in the city, has just one public toilet block. Many British cities do not have any dedicated public toilet facilities or policies, and because they have no legal duty to provide them, they don't have any ring-fenced budgets for public toilets and sanitation. Now, the numbers of people affected in a city like London are actually quite high, even though the context is very different from, say, Mumbai or Bangalore. Over 1 million people in London are aged over 65. Over 1 million people are disabled. Over 500,000 have Crohn's and colitis conditions, which means they have to get to toilets quickly. Many more are breastfeeding, pregnant, suffering from conditions that make getting to a toilet vital. So this is millions of people who are impacted by this. As much as 20% of the UK population experiences what has been called the loo leash, whereby inadequate toilets deter people from leaving their home as often as they would like. At the same time, people who are homeless or who are part of the growing army of delivery workers across London and beyond, or part of the gig economy, so-called gig economy of casual workers, or working in the nighttime economy, find that there are simply no toilets available at all for the work that they do. So the London Assembly, a public body tasked with scrutinising the work of the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has made the argument that public toilet provision isn't just a moral and health improvement, it's also an economic investment. The failure to provide decent toilets could well be in violation of the UK's Equalities Act, given that many groups, disabled and elderly users, for example, or those with certain illnesses, have very few sanitation options beyond the home, especially if you're on a lower income. So that's my third snapshot of the global sanitation crisis. The fourth and the final snapshot is to do with infectious diseases. So Hussein Ali, a resident of the town of Bebnine in North Lebanon, describes his town in the grip of a cholera outbreak that has impacted his family and his neighbours. We don't know where we got infected from, he says. Is it the air or is it the water? We're living in a state of panic. We're afraid of everything now. In Lebanon, economic crisis has rendered many key infrastructures like sanitation dysfunctional. Also electricity, treatment plants, and water systems. The last known cholera outbreak was 30 years ago, 30 years ago. But in recent years, we've seen hundreds of suspected cases across Lebanon. In Bebnine, the town that I was just mentioning through that quote, a river of brown water runs through the centre, piped into some of the homes, spilling into nearby cropland, affecting agriculture and food supplies. Residents worry about whether the crops they grow are safe, but there is no alternative food. Cholera can be treated, as we know, but rapid care is vital, and health services are struggling to cope more than ever. The government in Lebanon has said it will cover the costs of cholera for its citizens, but there are more than 1 million refugees in Lebanon, mainly from Syria, who cannot have their costs covered through these schemes, but who are amongst the most vulnerable. 29 countries have reported cholera outbreaks in 2022 alone. The World Health Organization has described the global rise in cholera as unprecedented, noting that at the same time, there's a global shortage of vaccine supply. Last summer, cholera cases in Syria were as high as 25,000 infections, refugee camps often crowded, often lacking basic infrastructure like sanitation or toilets, have the highest rates of infection. So over the past few decades, as we know, epidemics and pandemics of fecal-associated infectious disease have become worryingly more common. cities continue to grow into rural areas, and the potential for waste and people to mix intensifies. The combination of cities spreading into new habitats, massive agricultural economies, ecological destruction, and mass global trade has led to new pathways for infection, to which vulnerable and previously unexposed people are especially at risk. So agents like Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, and of course coronaviruses, as we know, are now more likely to move from animals to humans, often through manure. Now, this is not, to be clear, this is not just an issue of low-income residents living on the edge of cities. This is actually to do with the failure to invest in adequate sanitation infrastructure and services to support people living mainly in peripheral urban areas. So nearly 2/3 of human pathogens are zoonotic in origin, right? Come from animals into humans. And urbanization, climate change, and inequality are increasing the risks of the successful leap from animals to humans, as we saw with COVID-19. Many of these don't have the serious consequences, of course, of COVID-19, but the potential is there for that to happen. And then, of course, there's the risks associated with livestock and slaughterhouses and so on, which are connected to this story. All of this is linked to a range of health consequences, from diarrhea to soil-transmitted helminth infection and trachoma, to environmental enteric dysfunction, stunted growth in children, long-term consequences for pregnant women, and those who are immunocompromised. A third of deaths among children under 5 are due to diarrhea caused by pathogens that are found in animal feces, often in poor neighbourhoods. So what these 4 snapshots that I've opened the talk with tell us is that sanitation is a fundamentally networked problem. It's a networked problem. So what I mean by this is that sanitation is always spilling over into other kinds of issues, right? It's always more than toilets alone. It needs to be understood and addressed as always more than toilets alone. This is an approach to sanitation that most research and too much policy has failed to meaningfully grapple with. Sanitation is fundamental to poverty, inequality, and life in the city. It's about infrastructure and toilets for sure, but it's also about gender, it's about race, it's about disability, it's about caste, education, health, and so on. It's about work and labour. It's about how a city welcomes its refugees. It's about utilities, spending. It's about governance and policy and budgets. It's about the law, the legal provisions and requirements, but it's also about microbes, infectious diseases, spilling between animals and humans and across global networks and so on. So these 4 snapshots are not just abstract issues to understand the sanitation crisis. They are human and environmental stories and catastrophes of people, families, schools, and everyday life. So what then is the global picture? Sorry, I get some more caffeine. So what we know is, of course, and this probably isn't news to most of you, but more than half of the global urban population, more than half, lacks access to safely managed sanitation facilities. Over 1 billion people resort to open defecation in unsanitary locations like under bridges, garbage grounds, railway tracks, riverbanks. We all know this, and we all see this, of course, regularly. Preventable deaths and health consequences arise every day. So in 2016, 1.5 million people died from diarrhea, which is entirely preventable, with a significant portion being children under 5, as I was saying. But there's nowhere near the levels of economic investment required to solve this crisis. Despite the urgent need, less than 1/3 of the required investments in water and sanitation are currently being made. The world's countries spend between 0.05% and 2.4% of GDP on subsidies for water and sanitation. And given the climate crisis, the sanitation crisis is itself intensifying. It's getting worse, particularly through flooding, but also through drought. So too much water in some places and too little water in others, which impacts sanitation. So the impact is disproportionately borne by the poorest communities, with increased risks of waterborne diseases and additional annual deaths predicted by 2050. So at the moment, unsafe sanitation results in massive health impacts, but it also results in massive economic consequences. It's estimated around 223 billion US dollars per year are lost because of the sanitation crisis. And that's when you factor in the health costs, but also the lost productivity, the lost salaries, the lost wages of people working, people being able to go to work or school or college, and then, participate in life in the city, for example, right? So inadequate sanitation can cost developing countries up to 7% of their GDP in lost economic productivity, which is a massive amount of money. However, investing in sanitation can yield significant economic returns, with every dollar invested generating an estimated $5.50 to $9 on average. These are stats that come mainly from economists. I haven't done this economic analysis myself, right? So the cost of providing basic sanitation, water, and hygiene for everyone, is estimated at around $114 billion per year over a 15-year period, right? So a colossal amount of money. However, that is significantly less money than the economic losses incurred due to the lack of proper sanitation, right? Because of people missing out and all the money that's not being spent as a result of people being ill so often. As the world's urban population continues to grow, the poorest neighborhoods, as we all know, grow fastest, and often on the edge of cities. The already insufficient water, sanitation, and waste systems face increasing demands. It's predicted that cities will accommodate an additional 2.5 billion people by 2050, which is only going to exacerbate the crisis in a time of climate change. Cities are increasingly fragmented, as we know, into spatially rich and spatially poor areas. 1 in every 3 or 4 residents, over 1 billion people, lives in so-called slums. And the percentage of people itself living in so-called slums may have dropped from 46 to 30% over the past couple of decades, but the absolute number has gone up from 690 to 880 million. And of course, these are just estimates. We all know how notoriously unreliable these kinds of counting measures are. So the actual number is likely to be much higher. So that's still more than half of the population of sub-Saharan Africa living in poor neighborhoods. And it's here where sanitation, as we know, is at its worst. At the same time, I don't want to imply that low-income neighborhoods are sites of despair and, infection, illness, and struggle. That's only, of course, part of the story. We're talking here about neighborhoods, not the image of the term slum conjures up. They're neighborhoods like any other kind of neighborhood, but my argument is that they have increasingly significant challenges around sanitation, poverty, and state disinvestment and abandonment. As I will briefly touch on, residents themselves are often involved in the production of solutions, but cannot and obviously should not be expected to solve these problems on their own. So the failure to prioritise and invest in urban sanitation crisis by states all over the world means that we will not meet, as we all know, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal for sanitation, which aims to provide adequate sanitation for all by 2030, which is only 6 years away. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, as many as 89 countries were not on track to meet the SDG sanitation target. But while the SDG sanitation target is important, right, it gives us a focus, it's worth reflecting on how sanitation for all is defined in the SDG target, right? So we'll just take a couple of minutes to look at that in a bit more detail. So this is the SDG target for sanitation for all. This is how it's monitored, right? The key category used here is that of improved sanitation, right? The category of improved sanitation. That's the top 3 on the slide, right? So that includes safely managed, basic, and limited sanitation. These 3 are improved sanitation. And this is according to definitions and measures used by the World Health Organization and the UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme for Water Supply, Sanitation and Hygiene, or GMP, right, the Joint Monitoring Programme. Now, this is the group basically tasked with monitoring global water and sanitation. But this definition of improved facilities actually includes quite a wide variety of conditions, right? So safely managed sanitation refers to basic facilities where waste is safely disposed of, either in place or off-site. The next one down, basic sanitation, refers to toilets that are not shared across households, right? So this is households that have their own toilets. And then finally, limited facilities refers to decent toilets shared between 2 or more households. So all of these improved facilities must include the safe separation of human waste and people. That's what constitutes improved, which is good. But because the definition of improved is so broad, ranging across these 3 different categories, in practice, the monitoring data can mistakenly include very poor sanitation facilities, including toilets where waste is spilled untreated into the local area. So globally, around a third of people who have access to sanitation are mistakenly defined as improved by the GMP, have connections to sewerage systems, but with no waste treatment at all. Only 6% of Nigeria's homes, urban homes, have their own toilet connected to a sewer, yet 39% of provisions are deemed improved according to this definition. Okay, so improved facilities can mistakenly include a whole array of systems in the monitoring data, including septic tanks, as one report by the GMP notes, which are not watertight and which are effectively cesspools. Right, so the GMP is tasked, the Joint Monitoring Programme is tasked with creating definitions that work across different global locations and forms of data collection. So it's understandable that the categories at work are broad, as we see here with safely managed, basic and limited. However, in lumping together such very different forms of sanitation under the threshold of improved, the definition might end up doing more harm than good. At worst, it implies that what are in practice profoundly unreliable, unhealthy provisions are acceptable, and we're not even going to meet the SDG target, right? So this is a measure that we're supposed to use to see if we meet it, which we're not going to do. And within that measure, there are all kinds of forms, wrongly counted as improved. So what we need then is a comprehensive approach to tackle the multifaceted challenges associated with sanitation, right? And that's where, in the book that Shreya mentioned, I talk about the right to city life. So let me just say a little bit about that before I stop talking. Trying to see how long I've been talking. Okay, so in this book that Shreya mentioned, was published last August, I argue that one way to understand and respond to the growing urban sanitation crisis is through what I call the right to city life. So this is the book. So sanitation, as I've been suggesting, is not only about toilets. It is instead an integral part of urban life, encompassing everything from living conditions, health, education, work, and well-being, to the overall ability to participate in city activities, socially and economically. So sanitation is fundamentally a question of city life, right? That's my starting point. It's not just about one domain in the city, it's about city life. The concept of the right to the city, popularized by Henri Lefebvre, the French social theorist, views the city as a site of exploitation and transformation. It goes beyond specific rights and encompasses a broader right to urban life, including the ability to shape planning priorities, budgetary decisions, and to live a fulfilling life in the city. By using the couplet city life, right, connecting city and life together, and trying to keep in view the ways in which urban sanitation is always already about life itself. This includes living and dying, living healthily or just about struggling through, surviving and thriving, but also life in all its guises, right? From human bodies and wastes to the microbial world and to wider ecologies that compose and are impacted by sanitation. So, and of course, we know there's a historical connection between sanitation and rights in cities, as I was saying at the start. Throughout history, struggles for sanitation have been entwined with fights for human rights and social justice. So we might think, for example, of colonial subjects resisting imposed sanitation regimes, including, of course, in India. We might think of civil rights activists in the United States advocating for improved sanitation for Black neighborhoods in particular. We might think about campaigns against, pay toilets you have to pay for that disproportionately impact women, and so on and so forth, right? The campaigns that historically have used the language of rights around sanitation. So some examples. In the 1970s, the one example here, the Committee to End Pay Toilets in America, CEPTIA, formed by a group of students, played a pivotal role in ending pay toilets across several American cities. The group ran campaigns and a newsletter which was fantastically called Free Toilet Paper, which I love, and was cited as a key influence in Chicago's decision to ban pay toilets you have to pay for in public toilets you have to pay for, in 1973. So the newspaper, Free Toilet Paper, described in 1973 the conditions and said, pay toilets are a disgrace and quite possibly a violation of our civil rights. Exploiting human discomfort for commercial purposes. Gender was at the center of CEPTIA's campaign, given that it was cubicles and not urinals that were charged, which meant that women often paid more than men. So if you move more than 50 years forward into an example which is a little bit closer to home in terms of India, we might think about a group like the Right to Pee movement in Mumbai, which is also campaigning against women being charged more to use toilets. So Right to Pee has, which is a collection of different organizations, has amassed a body of data about sanitation across the city. They began by surveying 129 toilet blocks in the city. They started lobbying the state, municipal and regional state, about budgetary neglect of sanitation for women and girls in particular. They launched a public sanitation campaign on railway stations, calling for improvements to toilets at railway stations in Mumbai, especially for women. Given that Mumbai has one of the busiest rail networks in the world, decent toilet provisions are vital. One of the organizers said, today the right to pee is everyone's movement, from women fruit vendors to doctors and educationalists to town planners and gender experts. Another activist in the movement, Usha Kali, has said that ours is a movement of sewage cleaners and sweepers, flower sellers and fishwives. One activist told me that the campaign had evolved from right to pee to right to the city, while another activist talked about the freedom to participate in the city, to move around the city, to not be stuck indoors, and repeatedly insisted that it wasn't about toilets, it was about citizenship. She said, it's not about facilities, it's a political statement. It's about saying to people, we're not going to just shut up and stay at home, we're going to ask how we can claim our right to the city as a citizen. So as activists well know, this is as much about planning and culture as it is about toilets and drains. It's about gender, it's about power, it's about caste, it's about class, and so on. As Shilpa Phadke and colleagues have written in their book Why Loiter, if we had to pick one tangible symbol of male privilege in the city, the winner hands down would be the public toilet. So when residents and activists feel they are not being heard through a discourse of rights, they have to find ways of trying to force rights, the right to sanitation, on the agenda. And sometimes they have to turn to protest of desperate forms, including forms of protest that use human waste itself as a political weapon, as a political expression. So let's think about one example, just in the interest of time, that I'll mention here, switching to South Africa. And this is the so-called poo protests in South Africa that started in Cape Town. The Siskona People's Right Movement, which has been engaged in protests against inadequate sanitation in South Africa for years now. So the movement began after the municipality in Cape Town provided so-called open-air toilets without walls, which was seen as an affront to dignity. Activists then emptied buckets of uncollected waste at targeted sites around the city, including the airport, main roads, government buildings, to draw attention to the sanitation struggle and to demand dialogue with authorities. So these protests then use human waste as a kind of political weapon to create a spectacle and to challenge political and social orders. By placing waste in spaces associated with elite and often hyper-sanitized areas, the protesters aimed to disrupt the notion that waste belongs only to poor urban peripheries. And instead, they sought to engage the urban sensorium, appealing to the senses, to the cultural politics of disgust and contamination. And they also highlight intersecting issues of race, poverty, and urban space, emphasizing the right to a dignified life and the failures of the state to provide basic services like sanitation. The challenge then that they put to the state was to ask the question as to whether the post-apartheid government really is post-apartheid, and to address the government's failure to address poverty, inequality, and social injustice, and to demand universal rights to sanitation. So this form of protest, of course, is controversial. It faced a lot of criticism, even legal repercussions, because it challenged social norms, disrupted established power structures, and so on. However, these kinds of interventions, and this is just one example, there's lots of other examples like this across the urban world, these types of interventions bring attention to the urgent need for the right to sanitation and emphasize that it's not just about toilets, but about social justice and the ability to live and thrive with dignity in the city. So they position sanitation as a universal right, addressing issues of equality across the city, and they also seek to improve sanitation for all, regardless of gender, race, caste, income, and so on. But while these campaigns are universalist in their claims, they're also avowedly spatial, right? And this is something I focus a lot on in the book. These are forms of activism which are very attentive to spatial differences across the urban realm. So the right to city life then is inherently spatial here. It encompasses issues like access, planning, governance, and opportunities for participation in planning and spending decisions. It involves understanding who has access to resources and opportunities within urban space and how meaningful participation in urban life can be realized, right? So it's fundamentally the politics of the right to city life is a spatial question of who gets what, where, why, and how. So the attention then to spatial difference leaves us with a dynamic and evolving understanding of the right to city life. The right to city life is not static, but constantly evolving and subject to ongoing struggles. It requires more than legal provisions alone and demands a shift in how cities are governed, lived in, and understood. The networked nature of sanitation and the challenge it poses necessitates a comprehensive and dynamic approach to addressing the urban sanitation crisis. The demand for sanitation for all, in other words, is universal, but the route to attaining it is varied, plural, changing, different across space, just as cities themselves are different across global space. So the argument then at the heart of the book, excuse me, and I developed this across sort of 5 different cuts into the sanitation crisis: people, things, life, protest, and allocation. The argument is that we need this kind of holistic vision of sanitation to realize the right to city life in cities. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. Let me just wrap up by ending on a hopefully slightly more positive note, and point out that there are, of course, as many of us will know, really good examples of things that are going on to improve urban sanitation conditions from which we can learn. I refer to this as affirmative sanitation, for want of a better phrase, but basically interventions which are enabling, welfarist, and supportive. So just a few examples. In Salvador, Brazil, 2,000 kilometers of small sewer pipes built between 1996 and 2004 through government investment, which connected 30,000 homes. In Karachi, Pakistan, the Orangi pilot project of civil society organizations built a small network of sewer pipes, improving public health and local environment. In Kampala, Uganda, between 2003 and 2015, the government worked with civil society organizations to increase the amount of waste, human waste, being treated by 30 times. In South Africa, the eThekwini municipality cross-subsidized water costs for the urban poor and provided more than 80,000 households with toilets. Ethiopia reduced the numbers of people having to use open defecation massively through a public health campaign and state investment by 2015. In Nairobi, the Muungano Alliance has brought together civil society groups, the state, community organizations, NGOs, global finance together to upgrade sanitation, housing, and other infrastructure, spending over $1 million in different parts of Kenya through community upgrading and so on. So across the urban world, we could go on with small examples of interventions by residents, by activists, by practitioners, and sometimes by states to improve sanitation conditions all over the world. And we know about some of them are quite high profile, such as this toilet block from Kotwadi in Mumbai. Some of them are celebrated and promoted in different kinds of ways. We have toilet blocks being sort of used as community gas facilities for cooking or selling to private companies. We have computer classes, dance classes, libraries in community toilet blocks, all kinds of examples. We have initiatives. That are used, of course, increasingly to connect sanitation to ecological change, to the climate crisis, so-called ecological sanitation or ecosan, where waste is increasingly used as a resource for fertilizer, for example, for fruit trees or vegetables and so on, and all kinds of examples that are proliferating globally and can play very important roles in addressing the global sanitation crisis. I think the only thing that I would say about this is that the one thing that's perhaps been lost is that the emphasis on small projects, such as the toilet blocks I was talking about, or the ecological sanitation projects, is that sometimes we've lost sight of the big infrastructure, like the need for the big, expensive investments, including in particular the sewer infrastructures, right? This is just another example of using waste as a resource. But the sewer infrastructures, the big infrastructures, right? Because the problem with a lot of the smaller interventions, ecological sanitation interventions, or the standalone toilet blocks, is that they often don't cope with very high density neighborhoods. They break down, they don't function as well at very high densities. And this is where sewers are, as expensive as they are often the best route, right? Despite their problems. They require a lot of water. They're not great for the climate because they require a lot of materials to build them. They're very disruptive, but oftentimes they last, right? They're effective in very dense areas, getting waste away from people and treated if there's good treatment facilities. So I guess I would want to kind of just push back a little bit in some of the stories I was talking about of successful sanitation interventions, just to say that perhaps the big infrastructure it gets forgotten about. There's a big debate in Britain at the moment around this because the sewers in Britain haven't been extended for a long time, and it's causing all kinds of environmental pollution. So nonetheless, these are the sorts of examples of sanitation working well, of affirmative sanitation, and it gives us a ground from which to build a story for the rights to city. Of course, for all these good stories, there are lots of stories of destruction. This is from 2021 in Pakistan. Governments bulldozing homes along the nalas, blaming poor residents, low-income residents, for clogging up the drains, when actually the drains are often clogged up through construction debris from other places, and demolishing poor neighborhoods. So instead of affirmative sanitation, we quite often see this kind of destructive sanitation intervention, sometimes supported by organizations like the World Bank and so on. Okay, so last slide. last thing I want to say is around what might change this crisis, right? What might be the drivers for the right to city life? And I just want to mention four things. Okay, so one is precedent setting, right? These are areas where I think there is some hope for pushing the dial on the right to city life, for pushing sanitation up the global agenda. So one is precedent setting. So this is when an intervention happens, like the Orangi pilot project I just mentioned, and that intervention demonstrates success and therefore forces the local or the national government to extend support to it. And there are lots of examples of this from Brazil, from different parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia, where community groups have often started a project, shown that they can build, say, toilets or simple sewer systems, and the government has come in to support with additional resources, right? So this kind of precedent setting is, I think, really important in terms of how we address these conditions. A second example is mediatized events. So these are the events where something goes badly wrong, right? So a neighborhood is flooded and human waste is pushed into homes or into the streets. A child dies in a toilet block accident. There was a case in the US, for example, of a teenage girl who had a medical condition, which meant she had to get to a toilet, and there was no toilets available this is in Chicago. There was no toilets available in the area. And this led to legislative changes in Illinois and other US states to provide provisions for people with certain medical conditions. So, for example, if you've got a medical condition and you say to a private company, I need to use your toilet, they have to let you legally because you have a medical condition. So sometimes events hit the media and get the public attention and the politicians respond, right? The third area, which I think gives some hope, is activism. And I was just talking about that. You know, I mentioned the Right to Pee movement. I talked about the Setia movement from the 1970s in America. I talked about the Ciscona poo protests, so-called poo protests in South Africa. Forms of activism, there are lots of others where they're pushing this up the agenda and keeping the government and the public focused. And then the last sort of driver, I think, is the sanitation, is the climate crisis, which is that what we're going to see increasingly, I think, is the impact of drought and flooding on all kinds of neighborhoods, rich and poor neighborhoods across the urban world, putting more and more pressure on water and sanitation systems, and demanding, therefore, investment from national governments and international agencies. So I think that in a way, the climate crisis is going to create huge problems for sanitation, but in doing so, will hopefully spark some kind of response and intervention. So those are four areas where I think there is some hope. So I think that the reason I wrote the book was because I think that now is a moment to get onto the sanitation battlefield and to push this agenda in research, in policy and practice. I think it's going to get worse. It is a crisis which is not abstract. It's happening every day all around us to people in all kinds of ways, sometimes small and sometimes large. And I think it's something that we should be trying to campaign for. So the right to city life, therefore, is my kind of way of thinking about it, hopefully connects with you and your work. I've talked for too long, so I will stop, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Colin. That was, just a really nice way to bring together, the interconnections between sanitation and so many aspects to, as you call it, the right to city life. I'll encourage folks to sort of put their questions into the Q&A box, but while folks are doing that, I would like to just get us started off. And Colin, I'd like to pick up on something which you said towards the end. So, of course, the sort of call to action, for renewed investment, renewed focus, is of course really, really welcome to hear that. But I'm left with that image you had of like the 19th century engineering solution, right? Like the big sewer system, and just picking up on your argument on the need for the large public investment. And I'm also just, this is an open question, right? Just sort of thinking through this out loud. A lot of our IIHS's own work has also started moving towards more decentralized off-grid solutions, trying to figure out what is sort of economically, politically feasible given sort of constraints that, we're working within and so on. And so, I mean, where do you sort of, I mean, and also, realizing that the sort of big sort of technical fixes also ignore all the sort of social, racial, all the other aspects that you highlighted as sanitation being interconnected with, right? It's very easy for a very large sort of technical fix to ignore all of those aspects. So how you are sort of thinking through this, decentralized off-grid versus, like a big push, state-led technical sewer type of solution. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Again, like I said, it's not like there's some easy resolution to any of these questions, but, just thinking through, from what you've seen in different contexts, it would be nice to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Shreya. So I think that I don't think it's either or. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm suggesting that, that we should imagine a world where suddenly city governments or national governments are endowed with huge amounts of money to build large or extend sewer networks in a very significant way, because it's an extremely difficult thing to do. It's not only expensive, it's very, very slow, it's hugely disruptive. It involves digging up parts of the city, shutting down major roads. It sometimes involves moving housing. So there's all kinds of reasons why it doesn't work. And if you look at many countries, they've privatized these utilities. Not really so much sanitation; it's often water. Sometimes it's the same. Sometimes it's the same utility, but in some cases it's separate. But there's been much more privatization of water utilities than sanitation, mainly because it's easier to make money out of water than it is out of sanitation. So it's not. We have to be realistic. I think that's right. But and there's all kinds of politics at play, as you said. However, I mean, I guess the way I would see it is two things. One is there is a bit of a short-termism in current thinking around sanitation research, but also practice. So there's been a big move towards these kind of ecological sanitation where you have small-scale decentralized systems, nature-based solutions, and so on, which is good. I'm not arguing against that. However, we know that they don't cope very well. Many of them do not cope very well at high densities. Some do. There's a project at the moment that I know about in Ethiopia using tiger worms to consume sewage in septic tanks, and it's doing remarkably well in really busy areas, high densities. Some of them work better than others. Most of the time, when you get tens of thousands of people in a very small area using toilets, they clog up, they break down. The problem is, I'm getting to my point, is that over time, this becomes more expensive than building large cumulative sewers. There is research, by economists that shows that quite often it's cheaper to take the hit of going into debt and building very expensive sewer systems, because over a 30, 40-year period, you will save the money in terms of health costs, but also because people can get to work, people can move around the city more. So there's that. But of course, as you say, it has to be right across the city, right? Which is, so there's two political arguments. One is for long-termism, not just short-termism. And the second political argument is for the geography of it, right? Who gets access to these things and where? How do we stop it just being cornered by wealthier parts of the city? This is as old as cities have existed, right? These are not politics we can shy away from simply because there's no urban provision which is immune to that kind of politics, right? Every urban provision, there is that debate: who gets it under what conditions and who doesn't. So it's not like there's a special case there with sanitation. We just have to be making that argument. So I would say argue for the short-term solutions, but see them as short-term solutions. Don't pretend that building eco-sanitation across a very big, dense, complicated city is going to be a long-term solution to millions of people's needs for sanitation every day over the course of an increasingly unreliable climate. Especially in cities that are rapidly growing. I just don't think it's a long-term solution. So it's a stepping stone. So we really ought to be arguing, I think, for both and keeping big infrastructure on the table, making the argument that in the long run, it probably will save money and be more reliable and less disruptive once they're built. That would be my response to that. But I know that lots of people disagree, and a lot of people think that we need to move away from big sanitation towards a much more decentralized imagination.
So we have some questions coming in the Q&A box. I can just read out maybe a couple for you, Colin, and then you can respond. So we have a question on what your thoughts are on the effectiveness of the Swachh Bharat mission in India. And we have another question on what you think about the need for a regional and customized type of methods of sanitation rather than a method which is universal, and one that sort of encompasses the ecological structure, resources available, and the climatic conditions for those particular regions.
Yeah. Okay. So just on those last 2 points. So what I want to do next, having kind of the book was sort of my attempt to understand the dimensions of this crisis and to start to think through a very broad way of thinking about it, right? What I want to do next in my research is work much more with engineers, with people in public health, with microbiologists and others, to think much more about the pragmatics of sanitation delivery in place, right? Not to lose sight, though, of the bigger arguments, but just of the right to city life, but to try to think through much more about, okay, well, what are the kinds of models here that would work? So those two questions around customized approaches and climatic ecological dimensions, I think that's where the kind of, that's where the challenge is with sanitation in cities. How do you provide universally, but do it in a way which works for local cultures, local climates, but also crucially how they're changing, because neighborhoods are changing, cities are changing, especially on the periphery, but not only on the periphery, really quite rapidly. So you need to be able to anticipate that, which comes back partly to sewers, I think, in terms of making sure you have future capacity for the urban growth. But just the one thing I'd say in general terms is lots of examples of that. I touched on some of them about how you do that. But in general terms, one thing I would say is that universalism does not mean everything should be the same everywhere. That's a kind of common mistake, I think. So the claim sanitation for all, that is a universal. I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't think sanitation, having a way of separating yourself and your human waste, is a bad idea, right? I mean, most people on the planet, I would say, would agree that it would be good to separate their bodies and their wastes for their health, right? So that I think is universal. What is not universal is how you do that. So the way in which you do it might be extremely different, even within a city, right? Differences in ethnicity, culture, religion, even within a city, might mean that different places have slightly different models for doing that. So I understand there's a tension there between universalism and specificity, but I think it's a manageable one. It's a question of how do we develop the models that work. On the kind of what was the other question? Oh yeah, Swachh Bharat mission. Well, I'm sort of nervous of kind of declaring from sitting here in my office in Durham to an audience in India, what I think is good or bad about the Swachh Bharat mission. But from colleagues who have done research around it, which I've not, and from what they've told me, and Shreya, you might have views on this, there has been successes, there have been investments, but there's also been an awful lot of blame, of violence, of false accounting, of corruption, of misplacement of resources, of kind of hyperbole and rhetoric. So it's difficult to have a kind of clear view. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on that, but I'd be interested to hear I'd actually be quite keen to learn from what other people in the audience think about that. I don't know, Shreya, if you have views on that.
Yeah, I think just like you said in your talk, right? Sanitation isn't just about building toilets, whereas Swachh Bharat mission seems to be just about building toilets, right? And not sort of
Right.
the whole spectrum of issues that you talked about.
Yeah.
But of course, feel free. I think folks, the chat and the Q&A box is open. Like if and we have colleagues from around the world, not just India. So if folks want to
Okay.
add their reflections on some of these as well, please feel free to do so. I'll just move on to the next question.
Yeah.
Which is on basically the privatization of sanitation systems, right? So in the context of privatizing sanitation systems, particularly in building and managing toilets and processing waste, how does this fit into the 4 hopes you've highlighted in the talk?
Yeah. Well, it's a worry, isn't it? Because obviously, if it's privatized, it tends to follow places where profit can be generated. So the construction, there's just loads of research showing that when you privatize water or sanitation utilities, those utilities will disproportionately cater to wealthier neighborhoods. It's just that just happens in case after case after case. There's lots of examples from African cities, for example, where that's happened. Because there simply isn't an incentive to provide to poorer neighborhoods which might not be able to pay or reliably pay. There is some evidence that when private utilities provide to wealthier neighborhoods which are spatially adjacent to poorer neighborhoods, that the poorer neighborhoods actually benefit from hacking into or accessing sanitation and water systems. So there's that kind of narrative, but overwhelmingly it's kind of seen as a negative. And the problem is that it's very easy to say, oh, well, private utilities are the problem, or but the issue a lot of private utilities have is that they don't, and state utilities for that matter, is that they massively lack resources. Utilities in general, whether they're private or public, are often not making a huge amount of money. So it's not a surprise that private companies then focus on where the profit is. That's what they're going to do. In the UK, for example, Thames Water, which is the London-based utility that provides water and sanitation to South East England, is massively in debt and is also being told that they have to come up with up to $60 billion of investment, And they've given a lot of money over the years to their shareholders, which partly explains their debt, but it's not the only explanation for the debt. So the problem, I think, with the sanitation debate is that we end up saying that privatization and these utilities are the problem. And we get stuck in the politics of blame. There's a lot of activism where it's about targeting the utility. But really the target is the state. The state is responsible for creating the frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, the ownership frameworks that allow for the privatization to take place. Sanitation, if it's a basic human right, which I think it is, and if it's fundamental to city life, the state has an obligation to provide it. If it's true that decent sanitation means that health and employment improve, and so the city and the country makes more money, which seems from what I'm reading in the economists' literature, that seems to be the case. If that is true, then why is the state not investing in it? What if there's not an economic justification, and there's not a social justification, and there's not a moral justification, why is the state selling off assets to private companies? Is it nepotism? What is going on in a given city that drives that, or a given country? And so I think the focus has to be the state. But in terms of how it fits into those 4 hopes, it undermines them. I would say it undermines them. It's one of these situations which the more catastrophic it becomes, the more likely it is for something to change and for governments to intervene and do something radical. But not every government has the resources to do it. There probably is the money in India, there probably is the money in the UK, but there's not in Botswana, for example, where privatization has often been forced onto governments rather than chosen by them. So it's a complicated set of politics that varies globally.
Colin, I'd love to hear. I think we have time just for the audience. I think we have time for maybe another 1 or 2 questions. But while we're waiting for other questions to come in, I wanted to ask you, take another chance to ask you if you could speak a little bit more. I mean, what you spoke about your future research on looking more at sort of the engineers in the system, right? And like engineering solutions and, how that plays
Yeah.
into all of this. And I feel like
Yeah.
there's a lot to be learned actually from, sort of a social scientist sort of geographer's gaze on, these engineering systems. Because, I'm also thinking about research
Yeah.
that some of our colleagues have done in Bangalore where, analyzing neighborhoods of the city, which actually have, access to pipes and like piped infrastructure, but don't receive the same amount of water as the wealthier neighborhoods, for example, right? And the reality is, of course, we know that there are sort of caste and income dynamics to this, but are there
Yeah.
also technical engineering issues that make
Yeah.
some neighborhoods, more vulnerable in certain ways, right? So I'd love to hear a little
Yeah.
bit more, if you don't mind sharing with the audience, like your plans for your future research and, what you're thinking to look at and, what
Yeah.
geographies you're thinking to look at as well.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, thanks. I mean, that's true. I mean, it happens to be true that a lot of poor communities live in peripheral areas, and increasingly so because of land markets, and we all know the story, right? So poorer communities often shunted into the margins of the city, spatial and economic margins of the city. Those areas often more vulnerable to flooding, drought, and so on. I mean, I was in Dar es Salaam last year with some people who Shreya knows. And you look at the sanitation impact on some of the poorer neighborhoods, it's often areas which are low-lying, near the river, on the coast, where you get kind of like increasingly intense rainfall, right, which is a climate issue, producing context 2 or 3 times a year where you get sewage and industrial waste just around the neighborhoods, and kids playing in it because of the lack of public space and all kinds of stuff, so circulation of infection that goes on as a result of that. So there is a kind of like, I'm a geographer, I'm a human geographer, but there is a physical geography to the sanitation crisis which needs to be understood better in terms of what kinds of engineering can then work successfully. So in terms of what I'm trying to develop, I mean, I'm talking with at the moment it's mainly engineers and public health people. We're developing a proposal at the moment, which is to try to understand different kinds of models that might work in different kinds of contexts. So one might be the low-lying flooded neighborhoods, another might be the kind of steep uphill neighborhoods. Another context might be the kind of like the sewage system, from the city to the treatment plant and beyond, and so on. So it's working through like different case studies, different kinds of sanitation geographies, and saying what kinds of solutions work. We're just writing it. It's quite early. Why am I excited about it? I'm excited about it because I don't know about you, but I don't know very much about the engineering. I have read some of the engineering, and I can last about 2 pages before I just lose track of it. I'm not an expert. I really think that's the challenge for a lot of not just sanitation, for a lot of the urban challenges that we're working on, right? Yes, we bring things, and we shouldn't be, we should be really proud of what we bring. We should be really clear about what we bring, right, as social scientists. But we also lack expertise in certain areas. Increasingly, that for me feels like a problem. Like, I've always been aware of it as an issue, but in relation to something like urban sanitation, I think any convincing kind of suite of solutions, it's only going to convince people if it's stress tested for economics, geography, engineering, health, these kinds of different dimensions, and that's kind of where my thinking is really. There's a couple of
Yeah.
questions coming in.
Yeah.
Despite practice for why is it still insufficient to process to a level suitable for reuse? Wasn't really because I'm not in India's user fees for sanitation. Not sure what that question is. I think I might be misunderstanding that question. Is that reusing waste or is it reusing
I think,
funds?
is it treating, processing sewage? Maybe you could clarify.
Larger way lead to
And
focus on organic sanitation methods rather than independent on chem. Larger way lead to. Yeah. Okay. Organic sanitation rather than chemicals. is it treating? Okay, it is treating.
Treating,
Right.
yeah.
So,
Why is insufficient to sort of, yeah, like basically treat it to a level that's, that then it can be reused, like the treated
yeah,
water post STP can be reused. That's
yeah,
the question, right, Aisha? I think
yeah,
I've understood it correctly now. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether that's data that refers to a particular context or whether that's kind of a kind of general rate, the 70% rate. I don't know kind of what that refers to, but I certainly don't know why that is. I mean, this is if you find out, Aisha, or if you know, then let me know because I don't know. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for that, but that is goes back to the issue we were discussing, which is the interdisciplinarity of this problem in the areas that you don't know, and that's that. I don't know why that is, but it's an important question.
So I think I know, Colin, we've gone over, the time that we had said. I mean, I love to, give you just the open mic in case you want to have any other sort of concluding thoughts before we close. I think,
I mean, I think
yeah.
well, firstly, I just want to thank you for sort of having me. I should probably say that I actually emailed Shreya and said, "Oh, I've wrote this book. It'd be cool to talk to you guys about it." So I sort of invited myself to do this, which is not my usual style. I not normally do that, so I felt a bit bad about it. But it's really nice to have this opportunity. The questions are really helpful as well. Thank you. I'm just aware that I wrote a book about which is global in scope and interdisciplinary, and there are things that you bring to that and things, and it also reveals those areas where you need to learn more. So thank you for the questions there, and that's given me something to think about. So yeah, it's great to talk to you. And by the way, one thing I do want to say, I have an electronic copy of the book, so if anyone's interested in it and wants an e-version of it, I'm happy to send it to you. Just email me and I'll send it to you, or email Shreya and maybe you can forward it to me or whatever is the
Perfect. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Colin, for taking the time and joining us. And it's always a pleasure to have you over. I mean, at IIHS virtually or in person. So, thanks for taking out the time.
Cool. Thank you. All right.
Yes. Thanks. And we will, for everybody who tuned in and if others who might have been interested in the talk, we will be putting this up on the IIHS YouTube channel. So, just feel free to circulate the talk. It will be available publicly.
Okay.
Thank
Lovely.
you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.